Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here this afternoon as we develop our inquiry mindset. And each of us seeks to answer the question, how will you enter the classroom a different and more complete teacher than before as a result of our conversation today? Victoria Rydberg, environmental education consultant with Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, will be moderating the chat box today and sharing resources that we collect collaboratively today. I'm Sandy Benton, field consultant for the Wisconsin Green Schools Network, and I will be your host. Our guest today is Trevor MacKenzie. Trevor is an award-winning English teacher and an instructional coach focusing on inquiry and technology from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Trevor is co-author of Inquiry Mindset, published in 2018, and author of Dive into Inquiry, published in 2016, both by Elevate Books EDU. We have just a few logistical things here to cover. And please note that this conversation will be recorded, so if you miss anything, you'll be able to come back and hopefully we'll capture that for you. Again, use the chat box function, and if you are on a device where you can roll over and see the screen, you'll notice that your cursor, if you move it to the bottom, then you'll see the chat bubble pop up. Click that, and then you'll have the text conversation available to you on the page, and you can move that box around as where it feels most comfortable for you. So we'll share the chat with you. That'll be pasted into resources. If you have some great ideas or links, put those in there. There'll be time for questions at the end. So use that chat box to ask questions, and we'll allow time to share those at the end. And there'll be a time when you'll be unmuted as well to be able to ask directly too. So welcome, Trevor. Thank you for joining us. In July, the Wisconsin Green Schools Network held a 3-day workshop called Connect, Explore, Engage in Inquiry. And we had the essential question of what is inquiry and how can I integrate it into my teaching practice? And we used this sketch note of the types of student inquiry, the swimming pool illustration, as an important visual representation of different ways that inquiry can look in classrooms. And many of the participants today have read or are in the process of reading Inquiry Mindset. Just to give you a little background about Wisconsin, in 2018, Wisconsin standards for science, social studies, and environmental literacy and sustainability in 3 different discipline areas were adopted, and the inquiry process is integral in each of those standards and as well as in NGSS. So with that in mind, making the shift to these standards, teachers, administrators, and other school leaders might be finding themselves grappling with how to make that shift to inquiry. So we have a few questions for you, and we're hoping that we might, here's the pun, dive right in.
Absolutely. Thanks for hosting me, Sandy. I appreciate it. And I look forward to our chat. This is fantastic to be able to connect with everyone. And we're so far away, but of course, the beauty of technology brings us closer together. So I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks, Sandy.
Well, and thank you. So in chapter 1 of your book, you discuss characteristics of the inquiry teacher. And you state, one of the things you say is that inquiry teachers go outside to come back inside. They look to the community for connections to learning and curriculum. Could you give us a few examples of what community connections you've made or your colleagues have made that have been particularly helpful to your students?
Yeah, absolutely. And just some context with regards to the sketch note in that chapter specifically. You know, I've spent a lot of years traveling the world, consulting with schools and supporting them in implementing inquiry. And in that consulting role, that support role, I kind of work in 3 capacities. One way is providing some kind of workshop where I lead a staff through several pieces of inquiry, if you will. And then another one is actually the most stressful. You know, I was just in Pennsylvania in front of 350 teachers, but that is nowhere near as stressful as the second example, which is where a teacher gives me a class of students and the teachers want to observe me lead an inquiry lesson. And that's stressful because, of course, I don't know the kids and there's no relationship there. So I always find that to be quite stressful. And then the third, of course, is I'm observing a teacher and they've given me a lesson plan and they've asked me to watch them and give them some feedback. And I share those three different contexts with you because over the course of the last 10, maybe 12 years, in all the schools that I visited and all the observing of teachers in inquiry that I've seen, these are the characteristics that I've seen surface in those educators. And I've seen some magical things happen with regards to specifically what you're referring to. Teachers have this beautiful tendency of going out to come back in. And that could look like many things, but in a nutshell, learning is not confined to the four walls of our classroom any longer. You know, technology, obviously I've referred to that now, bringing us closer together, but it also really does open up the learning experience to be more than just teacher and student. There are so many voices that we can invite into the class, whether they're experts in a particular subject area or discipline or field, whether there are other classrooms around the world that we can connect with and collaborate with. I've seen a lot of amazing things with regards to that specific tech piece. And then I've seen some really practical uses or strategies to invite other people in. I'll speak from my experience. You know, I teach high school and my sons go to an elementary school that's just a mere 10-minute walk from my high school. And so once a week, I'm invited in to bring in my senior level English class to work with a grade 1 or grade 2 or grade 3 class. And we probably work with that grade 1 or grade 2 class for about a month and a half. And we only visit them once a week. But essentially what we try to focus on is really doing an authentic and sustained inquiry project or unit with the littles, if you will, the grade 1s. And the bigs, my students, are the mentors. And so they come in and the bigs really love that mentorship role. You know, I often see these big athletic 6'5" football players just melt into becoming a mentor to a little 6-year-old student. You know, it's how they get down on one knee. It's how they invite curiosity and invite that mentorship, that partnership. That's really quite a beautiful thing. And really what we're looking for is, can we have the littles receive some mentorship and some support from someone who has some expertise with regards to research, maybe a little bit more involved with regards to what's happening with the components of inquiry, you know, the questioning, for example, the authentic piece when we're wrapping up the inquiry. So that's another way that I really love being invited in, or my students being invited in as inquiry mentors, if you will. And then also at my son's school, they have a really amazing outreach inquiry where they actually can go to the library, and the teacher librarian has prepared these inquiry bins, if you will. They're kind of big Tupperware bins. And inside these bins are all the supplies that you would need to get outside the classroom. And, you know, sometimes there are magnifying glasses for the littles. There are notepads and clipboards. They even have these little cute inquiry backpacks that they all wear. And there's a beach about a 15-minute walk. There's a park that's about an 8-minute walk. There's a creek that's within 15 minutes. And so they have these bins that you could sign out from the library and go and spark an inquiry with your students right away. And so again, you know, learning is an experience. I really love learning as a verb, if you will. It requires activity, it requires action, it requires experience. And part of that is definitely sitting in a desk and doing some work and some research, but also getting outside of our class, both professionally to deepen our learning, but also for our students, getting them moving, getting them outside. And you know, that really is the impetus for that specific characteristic, if you will, Sandy.
Well, thank you. So we have a few questions that are coming from participants. Some are on with us and some weren't able to join, but on page 64 in your book, you state that when students put things or put into words how their inquiry is personally relevant, amazing things happen, engagement is heightened. So educators are realizing right now that our system is biased. Could you talk about ways that inquiry-based learning helps, create that equity and close achievement gaps that our students, particularly our Indigenous students, our Black and students of color, might experience in our schools?
Yeah, that's a really powerful question. And, we could spend hours just talking about that equity piece alone. A lot of my research right now, I'm writing a third book, and it focuses on inquiry and assessment. That's a little bit of a reveal for you all. But inquiry and assessment, and how we can make our assessment more equitable and more student driven, if you will. I truly believe that when the question is the students, when the question that is being crafted and created by the student, true powerful differentiation and personalization occur. And as we saw with the swimming pool graphic, at times in the year, it has to be the teacher's question for many reasons, partly because of the modeling that we're able to do when it's our question, partly because there are certain curricular components that lend more powerfully to a structured, more teacher-directed inquiry. But when we get into that deeper end of the pool towards the guided and the free side of that swimming pool analogy, where students have the questioning skills to ask a big open-ended question, what we begin to see is personal relevance is the objective, and that's what's obtained by the student. And so no matter what we think is curious or engaging for the student, when they are asking their own question, that's where that personal relevance, that accessing prior knowledge, and all those values and beliefs and understandings that our students are entering our classrooms with, that's where we can honor all of that. I think of our local Indigenous peoples here in West Coast of British Columbia, Canada. And, we've had a standardized assessment for decades. And that standardized assessment at the senior level, it's worth 40% of our students' mark. It's pretty significant. And I think early to my career, where there was a short story students were reading on that standardized assessment that focused on a raven. And this raven was, a significant, if you will, animal character in this story. But, Indigenous peoples, what the raven symbolizes is quite different than what Western civilization has the raven being a symbol as. And that led to a really skewed assessment. If you were an Indigenous student and you're reading from those values and those cultural practices and all that belief system that you're entering our school system with, but then the assessment tool is tilted towards this westernized symbol, it's unfair, it's not equitable, and it's certainly skewing achievement in a negative way for our Indigenous peoples. And it was unfair for decades. And it slowly has begun to morph into something that now has a lot more student voice in it. And I'm not just talking about the assessment tool, I'm also talking about our curriculum. And so, imagine if an Indigenous student had the agency to explore a question of their own, and they chose the raven, and then the practitioner, the teacher, has a deep understanding of that symbolism as well. Imagine how personally fulfilling that would be for that Indigenous student to not just feel success, but to feel honored that their culture is seen in our curriculum and is seen in our assessment practice. So, going back to when I began to answer that question, if you will, Sandy, it really is a matter of, is the question the students, and do the students have the questioning skills to ask those big open-ended, ungoogleable questions, if you will, to find relevance and meaning to themselves, because it should be different for each and every student. And there are systems and frameworks that we can embed in our practice to make sense of all those different questions and help us kind of support each and every one of our students. But I really challenge educators to not just begin learning with a question, unit design with a question at the heart, but more specifically, at a point in the year, it has to be the student's question. So we're leveling the playing field, not just between teacher and student, but also between the majority of our students and the minority of our students, and really knowing who they are, what values and beliefs and cultural practices they're entering our classrooms with, and how can we leverage those to create personal relevance and engagement. And what I've seen time and time again, I'm sure that people who are watching this would agree, when students are hooked, when they're engaged, achievement increases dramatically. And what I mean by that is when they're writing about topics that are significant to them, when they're chewing on ideas and questions that are relevant to them, undeniably, whatever the product is, and I'll use writing as an example because I'm an English teacher, that product, it comes to life. And undeniably, their marks improve because of that. So I really challenge teachers to find, not just questions at the heart of their practice, but can the questions be the students more specifically, Sandy? And that will create that equity that we're seeking.
So, kind of as a follow-up to this, and in terms of personalized learning, you talked about how the questions come from the students. Um, all of our, we've got a range of abilities in our classroom, and all kids are able in many ways. When we think about some of the educational needs of students who may have individualized special education needs in English language arts, for example, or students who come to us having experienced severe trauma. How do you balance what those kids need within an inquiry-based classroom?
Yeah, I love this slide. Truly, a lot of my work in supporting schools and teachers and implementing inquiry is mapping out how do we get to know our kids? How do we truly get to know them? How do we create relationship? Because that overarching truth in education, that without relationship, everything in terms of learning is futile. How do we demystify how we build relationship and get to know our kids? And I think that happens on day one. I think, the moment they're walking towards our classrooms, how are we inviting them in? And then how are we actually spending time to get to know them better? And in getting to know them better, we're challenging them to get to know themselves better, both in terms of what are their strengths as a learner? What are they entering a learning experience with that they could rely on? But also looking at their challenges. And I like to call them stretches. What are the things that are stretching their thinking or stretching their habits or stretching their learning that those stretches aren't easy. Sometimes there's some tension there for students. And so part of how I begin the year each and every year is I ask my students to partake in a little bit of a learner inventory, if you will, where I kind of ask them to map out a few of those strengths and a few of those stretches. And then throughout an inquiry, we revisit that learner profile, that inventory, so students can not just remind themselves of what they have in their learner tool belt that they could rely on, but also to consider, are they growing in those stretch areas? Are they being challenged enough and they're being responsive enough and my support of them is strong enough that some of those stretches slowly improve and they slowly become something that they could rely on as well as a strength. I truly believe in the power of reflection in learning. And the more we ask our students to reflect on where they were, where they are, and where they need to go to next, and that's different for every student, but that specific question or those three questions, where are you, where were you, where are you now, and where do we need to go to next? I can facilitate that discussion and it becomes personalized for each individual student based on their responses. And then, I track those strengths and those challenges, those stretches throughout the year. And what I mean by tracking them is I'm documenting what it is that they're saying. Maybe it's via a Google form, or maybe it's just pen and paper in my grade book. But I want to revisit those strengths and those stretches throughout the year to support my kids and see if they're actually improving. So, how we build relationship first and foremost, but then how do we strengthen relationship between the student and their learning, if you will? And that sounds kind of corny, but if they're not leaving our classrooms at the end of a school year knowing themselves better as people and as learners, I don't feel like we've done our job as educators. And that truly leads to lifelong learning, if you will. If they leave our schools knowing themselves better as learners, what they're good at, and what are some challenges or some stretches, I think we've done an amazing job. This next book that I'm writing right now with regards to assessment, all too often it's the teacher telling a student, this is what you're good at and this is what you're not good at. It's always the teacher's assessment of learning or the teacher's assessment for learning. And I really propose that there needs to be student voice infused in all of that. It's fine and dandy if we have an impression of what a student's good at and what they're perhaps challenged in, but do the students know that? And can the students identify that first and foremost before we even do a diagnostic or before we even do any learning together? Because kids know themselves really well. They want a fresh start at the beginning of the year. They don't want a teacher coming in with an assessment tool that tells them, this is what I believe you being as a learner. So how do we flatten out that conversation and have the assessment piece be more student driven and reflective? I think that's a really key piece to creating not just relationship, but our students knowing themselves better as learners, Sandy.
Well, thank you. And that segues right to the next thing we wanted to ask you. We noticed in your the inquiry process journey that you've got the if folks are able to see this, that there's little road signs of reflect and revise all along that learning path. And you talk a lot in your book, or I saw this on your blog anyway, that based learning is not a hot mess. That's very deliberate and intentional and focused on student learning and standards. How, do you plan your units around when you're going to deliberately have students stop and reflect, or did these happen more organically in your classroom? Can you talk a little bit about how you develop those opportunities for student reflection and self-assessment?
Yeah, I think the short answer is both. And then I think the longer answer requires, well, like, how do you know when to do either? So definitely, I do some intentional kind of road stops, if you will, on that journey of inquiry together. And, those happen at different kind of milestones, if you will, throughout the research process. After I've given them some time to unpack some resources and gather some evidence and consider, what it is that they found, that would be a good time for me to pause everyone and get them to really look into what it is that they've gathered. And I'd ask them some questions about the validity of their sources. Has their thinking changed? How has their thinking changed? What are their next steps? So, in the research phase of inquiry, I'll definitely be really intentional with where we're stopping throughout. But sometimes it happens organically. Oftentimes students will just approach me, ask me what it seems like a really simple question. And in our short conversation together, I realized that, wow, what we're talking about here, everyone needs to hear this. And so all my students, they roll their eyes when I say this out loud in class. I say, okay, folks, can we just pause? I just want to lift up this conversation that I'm having with this student. And they all kind of roll their eyes because they know what's coming. We're just going to role play our conversation and repeat what it is that we've just said. And what I'm doing there is I'm modeling the power of reflection. I'm modeling the power of the facilitation. And I'm not just giving a student an answer, but we're having a conversation about learning where I'm really trying my best to have the student come to a better space through my facilitation rather than just give them the answer, if you will. And in that little holding up of that conversation, I look around the room and I see students' heads nodding because likely they're thinking something similar as to what that student's question was when they came up to ask me. And then they're seeing the strategizing, they're seeing the thinking out loud. And I think that's a really beautiful piece of reflection is, can we capture our students' understanding? Can we capture their thinking? So in my class, it happens organically in that fashion. Also in my class, I love to have my students turn and face each other in groups of 3. So a little pod, if you will, of 3. And what that allows me to do is, first of all, it creates the physical space in my room so I can actually walk through the groups and I can observe, I can notice what it is that they're doing. I could hear what it is that they're talking about. And I can even pull up a chair and sit with them to differentiate or just honor, celebrate, and listen. But, I think the physical space that's freed up allows me to get into learning. But also what happens is I just can hear exactly what it is that they're thinking or what they're doing. And then I can provide personalized next steps to a specific group. Because what one group may need, I may turn around and hear another group and they don't need that whatsoever, that direct instruction or that support. So how do I actually physically change the way my classroom's designed so I can better personalize learning and reflection in the moment? Because, some intentional stops are really nice, but sometimes not all students need those specific stops at the same time. So how can I use my space to personalize for each individual group? Another piece is I don't assign a seating plan in my class. And because I want students to come sit together where they have some trust and where they have some confidence and communication skills and working together. And again, if I have pods of students that are kind of similar in terms of skills, I'm better able to differentiate, which means that I don't have to differentiate for 30 kids in my class. I can go around and differentiate for little pods of 3. And again, I think that means I'm better meeting the needs of each individual student, again, when I'm designing my learning space in a little bit different of a way. So going back to that initial question, I think it's both, Sandy. I think I intentionally stop throughout learning after I've given them some time to develop ideas or get through certain processes of the inquiry process. But sometimes it's organic, and sometimes the organic stuff, the informal stuff, leads to more formal reactions or responses from me in terms of planning my next steps in inquiry, if you will.
And what you're saying resonates so much with me in a workshop model for literacy, either the reading and the writing, and an inquiry workshop approach with the small group conferences and instructional opportunities that sounds like you're able to provide through that process. So we read in your book about the 4 pillars of inquiry, and you gave numerous examples of how you might introduce each pillar, particularly important when students are selecting their free inquiry projects for the year. We were wondering a little bit on how do you touch upon these pillars throughout the year when maybe your students are working at that shallower end of the pool with more structure and support. How do you introduce the pillars to students in those cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should say that all of the sketch notes that you've shown and all the sketch notes on my website, you can download them for free and print them off, high-res versions. They're all hanging in my classroom. Typically I would do a webinar such as this from my classroom, but it's actually a Canadian holiday today. If you can imagine, it's our Canadian Thanksgiving. Oh. So, but we in my family, we celebrate our Thanksgiving on the Sunday. So this is just a nice day off to spend some time with you all. And I bring up my classroom because in a webinar, you'll see those sketch notes behind me because I use them as teaching tools. I point to them often throughout learning. With that map that you just showed, the inquiry process map, when we pause and reflect and revise, we'll point to the map to show where we are in the inquiry process. So this one, I talk about the 4 pillars throughout the year, even in the structured side, especially in the structured side, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to plant seeds early, so slowly they can blossom into one of these 4 pillars where a student can create a personalized pathway for themselves, eventually in free inquiry, if you will. I think most clearly or intentionally, I touch down through the use of provocations. Provocations are those really rich, engaging entry points into our curriculum. And sometimes I'll show a provocation such as a video, a little 5-minute video of a student who's following their passion, of a student who's doing something amazing in their community, or they've learned something new. And it's the power of a young mind, if you will. I really want to show students what happens when a young person has agency over learning and they take it and they run with it. Because if I were to ask my students in September, what are you passionate about? I'd have a lot of shrugged shoulders. And I do year after year. They'll say, I don't know, just tell me what you want me to know. Tell me what we're going to learn about. And I'm flipping that on its head, aren't I? By saying, no. What is important to you? What is meaningful to you? And we're going to explore that together in class eventually this year. So in order to ease students into that agency, I want to do a number of provocations throughout the year to really have students see what it means to have a genuine curiosity or a passion or something that you're highly interested in. So I'm always finding those amazing videos. I'll tweet them out every so often. So on Twitter, if you see me tweet something out that says, how's this for a provocation? Those provocations are really planting the seeds for when students have a free inquiry possibility or opportunity. I can point back to some of those provocations earlier on in the year, and I could say, I know that really resonated with you. When we were looking at machine learning earlier in the year and I showed you that provocation, do you want to revisit that as your free inquiry idea? Same thing with goals. We do a number of goal setting activities throughout the year, and that's the 2nd pillar. I'll often revisit the goal setting students did way back in September or October, and I'll say, do you want to take that goal and make it a reality right now? Do you want some really supportive time in this class to have that goal become something that you've achieved and accomplished? So, the short answer is we unpack it throughout the year through the use of provocations as seeds to more personalized learning and inquiry later on in the year, Sandy.
So how often do students do you find that as the year goes on that students start bringing in their own provocations and like, hey, I've got to share this.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I'll spend just 10 minutes with my students and I'll give them a concept, something like identity in English. That's a great concept for us to look at, structuring a big question around for a unit of study. And sometimes I'll say, I'm giving you 10 minutes to do some research and try to find a really rich provocation for identity. And so I just formalize it, and then we watch a few. Maybe they show them in little groups and they vote on the most engaging or interesting provocation from their group. And so we watch 3 or 4 as a class from that process. Sometimes I have students just send me an email like, I saw this and it made me think of what we were learning about the other day. Do you think the rest of the class would like to see this? So I think that's a neat piece that's reflective of the strong relationship I have with the kids. And really, that's the foundation of really rich and sustained inquiries. Do we know our kids? Do they trust us? And are they willing to eventually get to that space where we're almost co-designing learning, aren't we? It's no longer the teacher and the student hierarchy. We're trying to level that off a bit. And I think, yeah, when I get those emails from kids or when they're bringing in ideas, I think I've nailed that balancing, if you will. And it is a balance. So much in the inquiry classroom is a balance between, our curriculum and student passions. That's a great example. And it's not either or, the two should be overlap. They should be woven together. And so we need to know our students' questions, their curiosities, their passions. And I think the 4 pillars is one way that we can get to know those better. And many of our students who don't possess those, we can plant the seeds through provocations. So hopefully they grow into something more important and personalized later on in the year.
Well, thank you. In chapter 7, you talk about the role of questions in inquiry. Questions are at the heart of inquiry. And you give some really great ideas, such as the wonder wall or the curiosity jar. And I know from my own experience, I really start off really excited about some of these tools. And I am very guilty of sometimes having these great ideas sort of fall to the wayside and they become wallpaper in my classroom, and the kids know it, and I feel very badly about it that I'm not using them to their fullest potential. How can we really make sure that we keep these fresh to further our students' agency and inquiry?
Yeah, that's a hard question for me to answer because really, from my experience, it just becomes a matter of prioritizing and making sure that if those are the things that I truly value in my classroom, then I have to hang my hat on that. I have to really, really have that be the thing that guides all of my decision and how we spend time in the classroom. So, an example would be, I really do value the role of questions and the questions that my students ask, the questions I create. I need to make those the front and center of my classroom. So if you were to see my classroom right now, above the projector screen, there's our big open-ended, ungoogleable question. And since we're shallower in the pool, it's my question that I've created. But that question's front and center. And so whenever we are unpacking a resource or having a class discussion, or we've done some research, whenever something's happened in the class that deepens our understanding of that question, either I point to it or ask my students to make connections to it. And so what used to be a lecture format, I had one of those lecture stands that I would stand behind and I would ask my students to take notes for a certain duration of a block. Now, really, it's more connection time, and I'm facilitating the discussion and the research, and I'm always asking students to make connections to that big question. So, it sounds like an easy answer, but it really is a tough one for teachers to reprioritize what it is that they want our students to leave our classrooms with. And, this sketch note specifically allows us to begin to look at our design of our classrooms and design of our learning space so that we can start to make some of these things a priority. The Wonder Wall is a great example. Once you dedicate a whole wall to student wonderings, it's awfully hard to ignore that wall, isn't it? Like that's a massive, dedication to wonderings. And so part of what this sketch note really reinforces and suggests for teachers is adopt a few of these ideas, these artifacts into your practice. And slowly what you'll start to see is you'll rely on these artifacts more meaningfully and more consistently in your practice. because that transition's hard. You know, leaving the lecture stand for me was extremely challenging. It took me a number of years to get out from behind that lecture stand and eventually let go of the lecture stand, have it be something in the corner of my room that I bring out when the time calls for it. Those changes come glacially slow at times. They came really slow for me. And this sketch note really tries to identify some of those artifacts or ideas or activities that have teachers really embed questioning, for example, as being the sharp end of our time with our students.
Thank you. So when, you talked about the glacial process sometimes of making the changes, what are some of the common struggles that you see teachers experiencing, and how, as a coach, were you able to support teachers as they, make sense of this in their classroom, and like you say, make it an and start making the shift to being leveling things between students and teachers and students in the curriculum?
Yeah, there are three big barriers to successful implementation of inquiry. And this isn't just from my experience, this is my research. I spent 4 years doing my graduate work on successful implementation of inquiry. So the first one is there's a lot of confusion around what inquiry is and what it isn't. And a lot of teachers think inquiry is just the free end and it's that deep end of the pool. And that's just not the case. There are 4 types. And so if we're constantly going to the free end and we're throwing our kids into the deep end too fast and too soon, then we're going to see students flail, we're going to see students fail, and then we're going to see students be anxious and uncertain because, that's not supported inquiry. So part of my work has been to demystify the 4 types and really have teachers narrow in on where they are in that pool and where they need to go to next. So, that's one is, get the confusion out and bring that swimming pool graphic in for all people in our schools, from our principals and our leaders to the teachers, to the students, and to the parents. That swimming pool analogy, I staple it as part of our core syllabus. So parents see how we're going to operate throughout the year. Students see it because we're pointing to it throughout the year. And then what that does is the second piece. We need to be talking about teaching and learning using the same language, and there can be no confusion in our organization, in our school. So when a principal stands up and starts talking about inquiry, they need to look at that swimming pool graphic. They need to use all 4 types, and they need to understand what it is that we're asking of our students. If we are talking about inquiry, well, who is an inquirer? What skills and understandings do we want for our students to be leaving our classrooms with at each specific grade level? So then we start to look at how are our schools planned in terms of a scope and sequence, if you will, from each grade. So students are leaving our classrooms with that common language that from the principal to the teacher to the student, they understand as being, what it is that's going to happen in our classrooms. And then the third one, and this is a big barrier, teachers need support. And that sounds so, obvious, but in so many spaces that I've seen and so much of the research I've done, teachers are told, this is our new curriculum. Inquiry is in our curriculum. Now go teach it. And there's very little support in terms of rolling these ideas out or implementing these ideas. Part of my published work, of course, is meant to solve that challenge. Here are 2 amazing resources from a practicing teacher to help you roll out and implement strong inquiry. But beyond my work, I think it happens in terms of really strong PLCs coming together within a school, like-minded teachers who are really focused on a few achievable goals, and they meet regularly to chew on those goals and talk about how they're working towards meeting those goals. And that requires some funding in terms of time. It requires some funding in terms of what's the focal point. Maybe it's bringing in a book such as mine to spearhead that support. But, if we're talking about implementing curricular change, there needs to be support from the top of the organization down to the people who are focusing on that change, the instructional side of that change, and those are our teachers. So, again, the 3 big ones are we need to be, not confused around what inquiry is. We need to adopt those 4 types. Then we need to be talking about those 4 types throughout our whole school, from principal to teacher to student to parents. And then for true implementation to occur, teachers need that ongoing support. And what does that ongoing support look like in terms of meeting the needs of the specific school?
Thank you. So you talk about making the shift and really understanding and reflecting on where the students are, and the teachers also making that shift, and the the language and the conversations in the PLCs. At some point, there's going to be some demonstration of learning, and you talk about how you showcase nights, and the showcasing student learning can be something that really helps show students each other and the community and the parents what the students are learning through these approaches. What advice do you have for those of us who want to showcase student learning, so that these presentations are more than just, hey, here's my great display board or this model that I've created, that it's more than the product of learning, that it really, really highlights their process and their understanding, the learning that took place, up here, and that they can demonstrate.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. That's a big question. Yeah, we have to move away from a product-oriented assessment belief or framework. The product, it's important, but it can't just be the only thing that is our focus. And we need to move away from summative, and shift towards, well, what's the balance between our formative and our summative? As an English teacher, I used to take home maybe 30, 40 essays in a single year. It was just, it was killing me. It was breaking my back. And now I maybe have my students write maybe 4 essays in a year, but I mean, my formative is way up here. And so when my formative is so strong and I'm giving my students such clear and meaningful feedback, the summatives improve. So when my focus shifted on feedback, and process, inevitably the products improved. So, we need to shift that balance in our assessment practice and what we're valuing our students doing. And then we need to provide a genuine space for students to talk about their learning. And so, I'm a big fan of galas, some kind of public display, as you had mentioned, of learning, where we can start talking about the process of learning. And sure, a product is a part of that process, but, answering questions like, what was challenging for you, and how did you, what strategies did you implement to overcome those challenges, and are there any ongoing challenges? Were you a growth mindset learner beforehand, and if you weren't, are you more of a growth mindset individual now? So again, those questions are focusing on the process and not just the product. And you can walk through a gala and feel engagement. You can see engagement. You can feel the energy in the room, and the quality of the conversations that are happening. In the galas that I facilitate at my school and at schools that I work with, we never put a time parameter on the speaking of the students. If you can imagine, students are at little stations throughout a space, and it's just a really free space, organic movement where people can come and listen or ask you specific questions about whatever your inquiry topic was. And, students, if I say you're going to talk for 5 minutes, it's going to be really scripted. They're going to look at their watch. They're going to speak for 5 minutes, and then they're going to stop. But if I say the gala is going to last an hour, be prepared to talk about your learning for an hour, and people are going to come up and see you and talk to you and ask you questions. It focuses on the process of learning and not the product of learning. And then it's a conversation. It's not a presentation, right? Students really have anxieties about presenting, don't they? But if you just flip your classroom so you're talking about learning, and you're talking a lot in class, I truly believe in the power of talk, and talk as an assessment tool, both in terms of listening and observing, but then to guide my next steps based on what I'm seeing and hearing in my class. So I really challenge teachers. You've seen me do this several times, right? Get out of that assessment practice where it's product and where is our formative and summative. And then towards the end of a unit in that gala space, can we provide some time and space where students can talk about their learning with one another and with people who aren't in our class? Maybe we invite another class over to walk through their learning from an inquiry. So yeah, Sandy, I hope that answers some of your question. And it was a bit of a long way to get there. Did that help, Sandy?
It did. What resonated with me is that conversation. Be prepared to have that conversation and how you got, to your destination, your end product. So
yeah, and the power of talk, absolutely. I'm so glad that you reinforce that, just to talk with our students and have them talk with one another and we listen. I think there's so much we can learn about how we can improve our instruction and our time with our students, but also how to better meet their needs when we are observing and noticing where they are in learning.
So Trevor, we're kind of nearing the end of our time here. In the introduction of your book, Inquiry Mindset, and then again in the conclusion, you ask the reader, how will you engage, or how will you enter the classroom after reading Inquiry Mindset, a different and more complete teacher than before? And you suggest documenting our growth, and thinking about our thinking. Can you briefly share how you've been supported in your journey? And then we're going to ask those of people that are on a computer and are able to enter a chat box. We're going to ask them, all participants, what are your shifts? And I'll do that with my hands too. Like, how have you made the shift in your thinking related to inquiry-based thinking? So our participants will enter, what are you thinking now? And we'll let you talk about some of the shifts that you've made.
Yeah, Sandy, I think I really try to embody what I want for my students as their teacher. So, if I want my students to be passionate learners, then they need to be around a passionate teacher. They need someone, and that doesn't mean high energy cheerleading every day. It means that I ask big questions of myself and I explore those questions in my teaching and in my practice. I guess the most traditional form that's taken on has been my graduate work and the writing of these 2 publications and this 3rd book. But really, it's day to day, it's hour to hour, it's minute to minute. I want to be a learner, and that learning is what circles me back to my professional journey, and in how I interact with my colleagues and with my students and with their families. And so really, I want my students to be around a passionate learner. That's been a shift I've made over the course of my practice. And I want to model curiosity. I want my students to see me excited about my professional learning, but also what it is that we're learning about. And when I started my career as an English teacher, Shakespeare is a great example. I love Shakespeare. I just can't get enough of teaching Shakespeare. And my goal was to, have my students love Shakespeare just as much as I did. And what I've shifted towards doing now is that rather than a Shakespeare unit or a novel study or a short story unit, now I ask essential questions units. Those big overarching ungoogleable questions. And maybe we read Shakespeare, maybe we read a novel, maybe we read poetry. Likely we do all of that in one of those units. But it's not the text first, it's the question first. And then it's, well, what's the prior knowledge of my students? Where is the engagement with regards to this question? Can I use their voice to plan next steps before I even introduce one of those texts? And so I don't overplan my units. I have a big idea in mind and an end in mind, but I don't plan out the details until I capture student voice. And that student voice will change throughout a unit. What we thought was engaging or curious about or interesting at the start of the unit, it may change once we've unpacked some research and we've done some reading and some talking and some learning. So again, circling back to really timely teaching, and timely meaning I'm gathering information based on what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing from my interactions with my students to plan next steps. So those have been 2 big shifts: modeling passion and action for my students, and then backwards designing units of study with student voice first. Even though I have an end in mind and a big picture in mind, I don't want to overplan that until I know what they know and what they want to know.
Well, thank you. So we have just a couple of minutes, and we might have some questions that either came up in the chat, or those of you who are on the phone. This would be the time that if you want to unmute yourself, and we can take some questions in the last couple of minutes here.
No pressure, folks. I know it's always a little nerve-wracking when you turn your mic on, but as you're thinking about sharing, I should say, and I know you're going to show a slide later on with some of my contact info, my website, my social media platforms. Those are really great ways to get in touch with me, and I'm very, very much open to that dialogue. It could be a direct tweet, it could be a DM or an email. If you're not comfortable reaching out in this format, please do reach out in the future. And if you ever want me to retweet you, just simply tag me in a tweet. And I bring that up because in my global travels, there are 15,000 people who are part of that community of people who are following me on Twitter. And, if I don't have an idea that is going to support you and meet your needs, I'm sure someone in that group of 15,000 does, or at least has something that I don't. And so oftentimes I encourage teachers, tag me in a tweet, and that's our little, secret correspondence that you'd like me to retweet you. And before long, what you'll see is genuine interaction with people from around the world that I've worked with. So if you're not comfortable reaching out right now during this webinar, please do reach out in the future. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you for that invitation.
Hi, Sandy, this is Victoria. There was a question that came in the chat box, but the participant had to leave early. And the question is, she works with teacher educators, so pre-service teacher programs. Do you have any suggestions for bringing how college professors can bring inquiry into their teacher methods courses?
Yeah, well, these books should be mandatory reading, if I'm honest, and that's not ego. I think a big shift for me was I had to move away from teaching like I was taught as a student, teaching like I was trained to teach, because I was never, I didn't grow up in an inquiry model, right? So I think, teacher education programs need to bring in these readings and use them in their practice, and then give students at the higher ed level some agency in that process. And it can't be the deep end. I visit institutions, higher ed schools, where I'm speaking to a room full of pre-service teachers, and I'm talking about don't kick your kids in the deep end, and the professor's blushing at the back of the room because that's precisely what they've done. They've given all this agency. So partly it's these books need to be read, and then those teachers, those profs need to give these teachers some agency in a really safe model, right, where we're not throwing them in the deep end. And I'm seeing global shifts there already. I'm seeing amazing young teachers entering our career, or sorry, our practice, our field, already focusing on inquiry, right? So, and that wasn't the case 10 years ago when I started this work. So it's a beautiful time to be in education. And I think that this change, as I said, it's slow, but I'm seeing the benefit of certain professors taking these works and bringing them into their classrooms.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. That's a great question.
Hi, Trevor. This is Emma. Thanks for speaking with us today. I was wondering, we have a number of participants here that are from Department of Public Instruction, like Becca, Instructions of Higher Education, or with other educational nonprofits. I was wondering if you had any suggestions for those of us that are working in these kind of statewide organizations and in a supporting role on how we can support teachers and school leaders as they develop their inquiry approach to teaching.
Yeah, so I was just in Pennsylvania last week. 350 teachers, every middle school and high school teacher in the district came out to see me, and it was a day. It was 8:30 to 3:30, and a day isn't enough. Many schools I visit 6 or 7 times in a single year. But I bring up that partnership in Pennsylvania because what a day with me looks like is not me talking at the front of the room for 8 hours. It is teachers in this space experiencing inquiry, and they're moving, they're collaborating, they're constantly building something out, a unit of inquiry that they can go and implement immediately in their classroom. And I bring up that experiencing inquiry because if we're truly talking about in those roles that you mentioned, creating capacity and bringing that understanding so it impacts our students, we need to create those PD experiences where the teachers or those people who we're working with, wherever they are in our organization, are actually experiencing inquiry. They just can't be sitting still through a day looking at PowerPoint notes. They have to be actually experiencing inquiry and watching a facilitator model what that looks like. And so, you know, if you're ever able to come and see me speak, all the resources I share, all the workshops, none of those are trademarked. Like, please, you know, cite me and using my work, of course, but, you know, watch what I do so you could be the trainer a little bit, if you will, where you can see what I do and then you could roll it out to go and create that capacity, because quite honestly, I just can't be in all places at all times. And so I think, again, it goes back to creating an inquiry experience for those teachers or those teacher leaders, because it just can't be a sit and get, right? It has to be something where it's more inquiry infused, if you will. I hope that answers your question, Emma.
Yeah, I think it does. I think, you know, it's important to model what we're asking the teachers to do in our workshop and not be sitting there and having a PowerPoint about how important it is to have things be hands-on and inquiry-based and not just sitting and giving lecturing. So
yeah, and you know, one of the earlier slides that Sandy showed, it was titled "The 10 Characteristics of the Inquiry Classroom." It's actually chapter 2 of Inquiry Mindset. And that's one of the first sessions I do with a new group of teachers. You know, we'll look at that sketch note and I'll ask teachers, which characteristics do you have and which characteristics are you going to focus on sharpening more intentionally in your practice in the coming weeks and months? So right away, teachers are identifying their strengths and their stretches, and it's personalized for each individual in the room. And so again, what I'm modeling there is I'm creating the conditions, I'm creating the ecosystem of our conversation and of our learning, but you have an incredible amount of agency to find something personally meaningful to you and relevant to you to plan your next steps for. It was just 2 back, if you will. And that one right there. So it's titled 10 Reasons You Use Inquiry. It's actually 10 characteristics of the inquiry classroom, but that's okay. And so, you know, again, focusing on which ones of these are our strengths, which ones are our stretches. And so the facilitator in the room has a really clear understanding of what the needs are of each individual in the space. I would do this activity again with a whole school, if you will, where we map out on one wall, well, what are our strengths? Let's put a sticky note for each number that you each possess. And if you have all 10 characteristics, throw up 10 sticky notes. And so if you will, you'll see these clusters, right? Maybe you see number 8, for example, a lot of teachers didn't identify as a strength. So I know in my follow-up and working with that school, number 8 is what they're begging for. Number 8 is the support they need. So that's one wall. And then the other wall will be, well, what's your lone goal? You know, of those characteristics, what's one that you want to sharpen? And don't pick more than one, because we want it to be achievable. I want you to be successful. And then what I see on this side of the space is, what are our goals? And again, that helps me understand how I need to support this group of teachers. Maybe a teacher who has a goal for number 8, I can connect them with a teacher who's identified from this wall that they do number 8 really well. And I have them collaborate a bit and come together. But, you know, again, agency, as I'm modeling through this little workshop, is something that the teachers we're working with, they need to experience. If we're asking them to provide agency for their students, they actually need to experience that agency in their professional learning. And it starts by creating that experience with them rather than just obviously talking at them, if you will.
Well,
great. Thanks, Trevor.
Lots of ways that we need to start making shifts for all of the learners in our schools and communities. And Trevor, this has been just the best hour of my day. I am speaking, I'm sure, for many of the participants on the call. And since it's your Thanksgiving, I'd like to express my thankfulness for your willingness to be here with us today and to share your expertise and get us thinking in different ways and making those shifts individually and collectively. And we're hoping that we can connect with you again in the future. You've given us ways to do that. And again, gratitude and thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, you're certainly welcome, Sandy. And you know, I reiterate thanks and you know, how grateful I am for the hard work that you're all doing in Wisconsin. I'll be there, you know, at the end of, or the beginning of next week for an event at season 9. So I'm looking forward to my time there. But really thankful for you all for attending and being so active in your learning and doing your best to best meet the needs of your students. So thanks, Sandy, for hosting me. I appreciate it.
Well, take care, and thank you for all of our participants. We'll send the link for this recording as well as any resources that have presented themselves. Be sure to check out Trevor's website and blog. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.